So my name is Skip Conover, and I'm the founder of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group on YouTube. I'll put the link in the chat, both on Zoom and on YouTube, so that you can find the replay of this session later on. And Tim Holmes and I created what we now call the Wisdom Path colloquia some months ago. We've done about 40 sessions at this point, and we've been inviting Jungian analysts to come on and talk with us about their work. And so today we're privileged to have Becca Tarnas. And Becca is, I'll just read her description. She's written an essay in this series, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt. And this series now has 4 volumes, and it exposes many of the wonderful facets of Jung's Red Book. Still have a small platoon of people that want to be here. So just a moment. Okay. I think I've gotten them all now. We're up to 50 on Zoom. All right. So to introduce Becca, and then I'll get out of the way. Dr. Becca Tarnas is a scholar, artist, and editor of Archive, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology. She received her doctorate in philosophy and religion from the California Institute of Integral Studies with her dissertation titled The Back of Beyond, the Red Books of C.G. Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien. Her research interests include depth psychology, literature, philosophy, and the ecological imagination. She teaches in the Jungian Psychology and Archetypal Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute and is author of the book, Journey to the Imaginal Realm, a reader's guide to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. So with that, I would invite you to begin, Becca.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm really delighted to be presenting on this topic and as a part of this series. So thank you for inviting me, and also thank you to everyone who is here to participate in this talk.
Just one question. Are you prepared to answer questions as we go, or do you want them at the end?
I think it might be easier at the end. I'll lay out kind of a narrative arc, and then I will be so happy to open up to questions and dialogue.
Okay, terrific. And so if everyone will keep their microphone on mute while Becca makes her presentation, and then you'll be able to unmute and ask your questions later on, or you can put them on chat, and I will do my best to monitor questions on the YouTube chat as well. So anyway, go ahead, Becca, I'm sorry.
Perfect. Well, so today I'm actually going to be presenting on a topic that I've been thinking a lot about, and it is the subject matter of the essay that I wrote for Volume 4 of Jung's Red Book for Our Time. But it's something that I haven't presented on publicly in this particular way, where it's really the focal point of the presentation. And that subject is the participatory imagination. And that's the title that I gave to this talk as well. It's the title of that essay. And at this point, that term participatory may not even mean something significant to you, but I'm hoping by the end of the talk that this will become part of your vocabulary. And this subject really came forward for me as I was doing my dissertation research. And as you heard in the introduction, I wrote my PhD on parallels that I found between Carl Jung's Red Book, which will be kind of the focal point of this presentation, and parallels between that Red Book and the Red Book of J.R.R. Tolkien. And for those who are familiar with Tolkien's work, most famously The Lord of the Rings, within the context of that story, the tale is written down in a book called The Red Book of Westmarch. And so when Jung's Red Book was first published, that name, the Red Book, struck something in my mind, in my memory. And I thought, that's interesting. Tolkien also has a Red Book. And so by this seeming chance, I started looking into parallels between the two Red Books and was shocked to find many parallels. First, in the timing of when Jung started his Red Book project, was really kind of dragged into it, and when Tolkien started this unusual series of drawings that he recorded in a sketchbook that he called the Book of Ishness. They began at the same moment, just right before the beginning of World War I, which broke out in 1914. So there were parallels in timing, in imagery, in the art they each created, in the figures that were each brought forward in these different books. Figures such as the wise old man Philemon in Jung's Red Book, or Gandalf in Tolkien's, and parallels in scenes, and then in a larger kind of cosmological sense too, the deeper notes or themes of the two Red Books. And in doing the research of comparing these two Red Books and looking at the parallels, new questions started to come up for me around the nature of the imagination. What is the imagination? And it seems that, when we dive deeply into Jung's work, for example, there's a reclamation of what we mean by the imagination. Often when we hear the term imagination from a modern disenchanted worldview, it usually refers to that which is made up, what isn't real. Oh, that's just imaginary. Oh, you just made that up. And yet, in the way that Jung, that Tolkien, that the Romantics, many others in that lineage use the term imagination, they're referring to something that is real, that is a source of truth, that maybe not just reveals, but also elicits something from the cosmos itself, perhaps from the divine. And so with these questions of what is the imagination? Is it more than that which is simply made up or invented? I started going down this path of really exploring the philosophy of imagination, and also of wanting to understand first of all, what technique Jung was using when his Red Book came into being, and then how that technique, active imagination, could have both personal and collective import. So I imagine that some of the people listening here are quite familiar with Jung's Red Book, maybe others not so much. So I'll just give a very brief introduction to what Jung's Red Book is. And it's definitely worth exploring more deeply. By the way, anyone who is interested in hearing me speak explicitly about the parallels between Jung's and Tolkien's Red Books, I have a number of talks available on that subject where I do show the images and speak about the timing and other parallels. So that is definitely available. And so Jung's Red Book project began in 1913. And in 1912, in the earlier months of 1913, Jung was feeling this extraordinary pressure. He described it as a pressure in the unconscious, and very significant dreams were coming to him. And he wasn't really understanding what it was that was trying to come through him, but he had a sense that he needed to find out. And on October 17th, 1913, Jung was struck by an extraordinary vision. He was on a train journey, and the vision of a great flood inundating Europe came to him. A flood that destroyed the civilization across Europe. and he saw this this inundation covering the continent. And near the end of the vision, the flood itself turned to blood, and it was the waters of the blood were filled with rubble and destruction. And he was terrified. He had no idea what this meant. And 2 weeks later, he had another vision like this. And it came with the words saying that this was wholly real and would come to pass. And because of what these visionary experiences opened for him, Jung started to write in a dialogue with his soul. So in November of 1913, he took up a journal he had set aside 11 years before, and he wrote in it, my soul, where are you?" He was calling to his soul. He recognized he had lost connection with his soul. And this began a process of engaging with what he would call fantasies. And they would arise through him in a practice that he developed, but it's a practice that has an ancient lineage, and he called it active imagination. So I will be first going into what the practice of active imagination is, and then looking at how we can understand what the active imagination practice, what it reveals. Because for Jung, and I think for others, it can sometimes be conceptualized as active imagination reveals the contents of the collective unconscious. And Jung described his Red Book experiences as a confrontation with the unconscious. But I want to introduce some philosophical terms about what kind of knowing active imagination might actually be. And so this talk is more of a philosophical approach to a psychological subject. So I'm actually going to be drawing on several very important thinkers throughout the history of philosophy, such as Plato and Thomas Aquinas and Friedrich Schelling and Owen Barfield, to discuss this term participation and what is meant by that. And then to introduce the idea that active imagination may be a form of participatory knowing. And I'll just leave that term there for now, participatory knowing. I'm going to be introducing certain terms and using them repeatedly, such as participation, enaction. That's one I'll give a good definition for. Co-creation, archetype, and imaginal. These are terms I'm going to keep returning to. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you will leave feeling like you have a good working definition of all of those terms. So in terms of what active imagination is, it's actually a practice that has an ancient pedigree. It has roots in Neoplatonism and the Kabbalah and Gnosticism and Christian mysticism, Sufism, the Hermetic tradition, all have different forms of what Jung referred to as active imagination. So it's a psychological practice, but it's also a spiritual practice. And in terms of what active imagination can be understood as, it's as I just touched on before, it's not just a means of accessing or revealing the objective nature of the unconscious. It's not like in a scientific experiment observing an object which is distinct from us, which is what a modern worldview would say we are doing in scientific experimentation. Human subject or scientist observing an objective object. With quantum physics, that idea has been dismantled, even if it hasn't been fully integrated into our worldview, that the subject affects and elicits forth the object. So I'm holding a similar idea here. And so we can think of the practice of active imagination that Jung engaged in as, again, I'm going to use some of these fresh terms, as enacting or calling forth and participating in the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And that's the statement that I'm going to continue to unfold what it means. Now, the philosophy of participation extends all the way back to Plato. And the idea of participation has evolved through the history of ideas. But at its core, what the understanding of participation is basically, how do universals relate to particulars? And how do particulars partake in universals? And this idea of participation can help us to understand different spiritual traditions and religions, to understand how they've arisen in various cultures. Why is it there's such a diversity of religions all around the world? And if we hold a more pluralistic perspective on religion or spirituality or mystical experience or psychological experience, and recognize that diversity, we need a concept like participation to make sense of why that diversity is there without creating a hierarchy, like this religion is more accurate than that one. So this concept is really to help break down those hierarchies of religion, spiritual practice, mystical experience. But it's also not as simple as relativism or anything goes. It's a means of understanding how these unique disclosures of the divine come through in different individuals or through different cultures and religious or spiritual practices. So what I am suggesting that in Jung's Red Book, which is a book filled with fantasies, one can, and by fantasies, I don't mean something unreal. I mean visionary experiences that were called forward and then recorded. Jung saw his Red Book as a record of his experience. And that record, which he then commented on in these beautiful lyrical elaborations, as the editor Sonu Shamdasani refers to them, lyrical elaborations, the secondary commentary on the fantasies, gives context to what Jung was going through. But he's wrestling with these experiences. He is wrestling with these internal visionary experiences that he is actively engaging with, because what Jung's Red Book offers us is the validation that one can have visionary experiences and not be psychotic. And that is an extraordinary breakthrough, especially in Jung's time, that the imagination reveals genuine truth and experience, but it is different than physical reality, material reality. It is of a different order of reality, psychological reality, imaginal reality. So you can see here, our terms start to break down. When we contemplate Jung's Red Book, the boundaries between seeming opposites start to crumble. The boundaries between inner and outer, individual and collective, fantasy and reality, and imagination and fact, they start to blur. And Jung's Red Book is a very personal project. It's a personal encounter with the unconscious. But Jung found that it had collective import. And the reason he realized that was because when he had that flood vision in 1913, 9 months later, the First World War broke out, devastating the exact same lands that he saw devastated by the flood in that vision. And he realized that his experience was prophetic of the war. And at that point, he had to recognize that the months of fantasies, of active imagination experiences that he had been engaging with were not just personally relevant to him, but also had collective import. that also had something to share on a larger scale. He had tapped into something deeper than just the individual and just the personal. And so this brings up the question of whose agency was at work when Jung embarked on the path into the world of images. Was it his own individual agency? Or was it the will of what he came to call the spirit of the depths? Or maybe, and this is what the idea of participation introduces, was it both? Were they co-creating together? So I would say that Jung didn't simply discover or just purely create out of himself the fantasies, the imaginal figures that he encountered in the Red Book, but rather enacted or called forth, co-created those figures and those landscapes that were emergent in the fantasies. Now, I just want to say something about the term unconscious, because the unconscious is a concept that appeared with modernity. And if we go back several centuries and look to what René Descartes brought into philosophy, Descartes made a clear dualistic distinction between conscious mind and unconscious matter. That was essentially the duality of the world, conscious mind and unconscious matter. The human being has a conscious mind, God has the conscious mind, and that is the conscious connection between the two. And all else, the entire world, is unconscious matter from Descartes' perspective. And of course, this really it culminates the initiation of modernity. I think that's the best way to put it. Modernity had been initiated before, really at the beginning of the Renaissance, but Descartes sets it in motion in a new way. And when you have such an intense duality between conscious mind and unconscious matter, there's no room for unconscious mind. Where does that go? And so almost immediately with that distinction, philosophers in Europe, particularly German idealists and English romantics, start to speak about the Unbewusste, the unconscious. And this was emerging in different philosophers' language. For example, Friedrich Schelling, speaking to this perception of mind that is nonetheless not conscious in the way that Descartes meant it. And so when Freud comes along with his extraordinary breakthrough, speaking of the psychological unconscious, this is more a culmination of a process rather than something new. It peaks with Freud and then deepens with Jung. Because for Freud, the unconscious was repressed personal and also civilizational material, kind of like a garbage heap where we put everything, the memories, feelings, experiences that we don't want to deal with. They all get repressed, whether as an individual human being or at a cultural civilizational level. That's the unconscious. And Jung, through his fantasies, through his experiences that led to the creation of the Red Book, and also his work with his patients, came to realize the unconscious is not a garbage heap of repressed material. The unconscious is actually a domain in which all the myths and archetypes and stories of the world exist. It is a whole world. It is everything. But so that term, collective unconscious, it's actually a term that's standing in for experiences that were repressed by modernity. Modernity, which said there is no myth, there is no, eventually, God, there is no imagination. None of that is real. What happens when you say that a whole world is not real? Well, it takes on its own power. And the unconscious, that term, it indicates something unseen or inaccessible, which is true for the disenchanted modern mind. But I think that eventually, when we work with the collective unconscious, we realize that it actually needs another name. It requires a name that doesn't indicate a lack of consciousness. And so I have drawn on the term articulated by Henri Corbin, who was part of Jung's circle. They would come together at Aranos in Switzerland, for example. Corbin was a Sufi scholar. So he's drawing on the mysticism of mystics such as Ibn Arabi in the Sufi tradition. And he describes what he calls the mundus imaginalis, the world of the imagination. And I love that term because it brings our focus, on the one hand, to the imagination, but also to the fact that what we call the unconscious is a world. It is a world accessed by means of the imagination. The mundus imaginalis is a realm that is nowhere and everywhere. It is infused within and through all of existence. And Corbin says that active imagination, this practice that Jung engaged in, that has that long lineage, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Sufism, Hermeticism, active imagination is the mirror par excellence of the mundus imaginalis. And the mundus imaginalis, I would like to propose, again, is not simply accessed. We don't just disclose it, see it in objective sense, but it is enacted. So now I want to give a definition for this term that I keep using, enacted, E-N-A-C-T-E-D. Enacted. It's actually a term from cognitive science that was coined by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche. And it was employed by the scholar Jorge Ferrer, who actually was one of my teachers at CIIS, in his work on participatory spirituality. I'll be unpacking more later on what all of that refers to. But for now, what you need to know is that enaction can be thought of as a co-creation between two or more agential entities. So you can think of that like an organism and its environment. How an organism and their environment co-create each other. They shape each other. A fox does not just live in the Arctic like the Arctic is a background. The Arctic shapes the fox, and the fox shapes the web of ecology of the Arctic. That is what is meant by enacted. And we can see this too in terms of the enaction or the co-creation between, say, a particular human culture and what we could call, what Jorge Ferrer calls, the indeterminate spiritual mystery. And really, you can just think of that as the divine in an indeterminate form, a form that has not been set yet. But when a human being or human culture comes into co-creative, participatory relationship with it, religions emerge. Mystical experiences emerge that give rise to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, to the individual mystical experience, to the plethora of shamanic cultures. All of these are co-creations between a human culture and this indeterminate spiritual mystery. And I would say one can also apply the same idea of enaction to the individual human being in relationship, co-creative relationship with the archetypes of the collective unconscious. And this is why it is applicable to what Jung was doing with the Red Book. So active imagination fantasies, if we engage in this practice, they are a reflection of both the individual, so Jung, for example, and the archetypes. What emerged for Jung that he recorded in his Red Book is archetypal and therefore has collective import. But it is also deeply personal. But we can't reduce it to one or the other. We cannot say the Red Book is purely a book of objective archetypes, and therefore we should all experience them in the exact same way Jung did. Nor can we reduce it only to Jung and say that's his personal experience, that's nice for him that he had that all by himself, but that doesn't have any bearing on us. It is both simultaneously. Active imagination doesn't reveal objective, pre-given spiritual or psychological reality. It discloses a unique expression of a universal principle or an archetype in accordance with the personal life experience and the cultural history of the individual. So for one metaphor that you could use for this is of an indeterminate spiritual entity that comes clothed in a dress that makes it visible and relatively accessible to the perceiver. And that clothing that it comes in very much reflects the archetypal nature of that indeterminate spiritual entity. But it's also specifically tailored for the creative perceiver. And I would say that this perspective both verifies the truth of the archetypal, which was, of course, Jung's project, but it also accounts for personal and cultural perspectives and even potential biases. And we certainly see this in Jung. We definitely see those biases when it comes to gender, when it comes to race, and holding what he experienced in that participatory lens neither loses the truth of what he experienced to those biases, nor justifies the biases. We can see the cultural situatedness that would give rise to that, while at the same time learning to see through it to what is archetypal at the core. So just to go a little bit more into the technique of active imagination before turning to some of the history of the philosophical concept of participation. As I've mentioned, active imagination was the primary method that Jung used to create the Red Book. And it's also a central tenet of Jung's analytical psychology. So this is kind of interesting because even though it was so important, Jung has written very little on the practice of active imagination itself. There's a wonderful edited volume edited by Joan Chodorow called Jung on Active Imagination. And it's about 1/2 inch thick. And it brings together everything that Jung wrote on active imagination. And if you think of the vast expanse of the collected works, many, many volumes, just 1/2 inch of writing is not very much. And he first wrote about active imagination in 1916. So 3 years into the Red Book process. But at that time, he referred to it by a different name. He called it the Transcendent Function. And that's the name of the essay that he wrote in 1916 on this subject. And he actually gave the practice a variety of names. He called it the picture method, active fantasy, exercises, trancing, visioning, and even the technique of the descent. And I've wondered why Jung wrote so little on this subject, despite how important it was to him and also in his work with his patients. And I think it's because the result is always different. It's unlike a scientific experiment where you conduct the experiment and then it's replicable. With active imagination, it doesn't yield replicable results because the fantasies are in part based on the unique life situation of the person engaging in the practice. But that doesn't mean it's not effective just because it isn't like a replicable scientific experiment. The practice is still effective at eliciting fantasies and facilitating psychospiritual transformation. So despite how personal its origins may be, I think that active imagination, when it's faithfully practiced, can lead one deep enough into the psyche to uncover collective structures, a shared substratum. And this is what Jung's research revealed. And this is why the Red Book so importantly informed Jung's psychological model as he developed it from that point forward. So active imagination, I think it's important to differentiate active from passive imagination. Passive imagination is when we are daydreaming or in reverie, where we are just witnessing the stream of images kind of floating by, but not necessarily concentrating on them. They just simply arise. It's akin to dreaming, where when we are asleep, the ego is not in an active role. It's just set aside, so we're passively receiving the images. Active imagination requires something of us. We have to, what Jung says, we have to suspend the critical faculty. We have to suspend that part that comes in, that's kind of facilitated by the ego, that's saying, this is ridiculous, that I'm focusing on an image, that I am focusing on what is arising. We have to suspend that part that is critiquing and judging what is coming forward. And instead, we just simply focus on an image or an emotion. And we focus on it until that image begins to move. And it always does, because that is the nature of the psyche. The psyche inherently moves. It is animated, ensouled, anima. And so when you focus, concentrate hard enough on an image, it will begin to move. And if you stick with it, then there is the possibility of coming into active relationship with it. And even, this is what happened for Jung, stepping into the drama itself, crossing that threshold and entering into the imaginal field, into a world, into the mundus imaginalis, and engaging with whatever arises there, which often can be figures who have things to say, or landscapes which are just as rich and diverse as the landscapes of the outer world. So
Becca,
yeah,
there is a question on the YouTube channel. Could
please.
you describe one of these encounters as it appears in the Red Book, for example, with Elijah and Salome, or with Philemon, so that people have in their mind what these events are like?
Your timing is so perfect, because that is literally what is next in my notes. And so here's one scene that I will draw forward. This is from Liber Primus, which is the first section of the Red Book. And it is a conversation between Jung, and I will refer to, when Jung is within the fantasies, I'll refer to him as the imaginal Jung, or the figure of Jung, because that helps differentiate that Jung from the biographical Jung who is sitting at his desk writing down these experiences later. So the imaginal Jung is in conversation with the figure Elijah. And at one point, the imaginal Jung refers to Elijah and his daughter Salome. They've both appeared to him now in several fantasies. He refers to them as symbols. He says, "You are symbols of the most extreme contradiction." And Elijah responds in this clear negation of Jung's statement. Elijah says, "We are real and not symbols." And Elijah has to reiterate this point more than once. In a later fantasy, where Jung is bringing up the same response, saying that you're symbols, he's encountering them in the inner world, so he sees them as symbols. And Elijah says, "You may call us symbols for the same reason that you can also call your fellow men symbols, if you wish to. But we are just as real as your fellow men. You invalidate nothing and solve nothing by calling us symbols. We are certainly what you call real. Here we are, and you have to accept us. The choice is yours." This extraordinary dialogue that he has with these two figures. And if you read the Red Book, it is filled with these kinds of fantasies of the imaginal Jung encountering different figures, such as Elijah and Salome, or the serpent, or the wise old man, Philemon, or the old scholar and his young daughter in a castle, or the god Izdubar, who comes from the east and is seeking the Western immortal lands, and then is wounded when Jung tells him that the sun, which Izdubar is trying to seek out, cannot actually be accessed because it does not set in the immortal Western lands. It is a ball of gas millions of miles away in space, and the god Izdubar is wounded by this scientific knowledge. So the relationship goes both ways. Jung has an effect on these figures, and they have an effect on him. So there's a whole vast cast of characters that Jung encounters. And one of my favorite ways to approach reading the Red Book is by reading it as literature, by reading it as a story. But as you've probably picked up from everything I've said up until this point, I don't read a story like it's a mere fiction. I take it as revealing an imaginal truth. And that, I think, is exactly how we can approach the stories that are encased in Jung's Red Book. So the important thing to realize when we read Jung's Red Book is that these imaginal figures were not a part of his personality. Or if we engage in this practice, the figures we may encounter are not a part of our own personality. The archetypal psychologist James Hillman calls this the personalistic fallacy. He says, to speak of my anima and my soul expresses the personalistic fallacy. So rather we can think of encountering the anima, the soul, the wise old man, the great mother, not mine in an individual egoic sense, but as a collective encounter. And it's important to differentiate the conscious and unconscious contents and not egoically identify with what arises from the unconscious, because this so often can lead to spiritual inflation with an identification with the archetypes. Now, the ego or the critical faculty can certainly slip back in and intermingle with this fantasy material. And this is no fault of the practitioner. This is a slippery practice and a slippery world. And we find in such practices that we can overcome the ego, maybe even to the point of ego death through certain practices. But the ego never fully goes away, and that's important. The ego plays an important psycho-spiritual role. And the ego itself can even be understood as another imaginal person. Maybe it's the only one that we can say my ego about, because it's the one that gives us the capacity to say my in the first place, to identify as an individual with something. So now, of course, there have been critiques that active imagination is not really an authentic representation of the unconscious. The Jungian Wolfgang Gigerich suggests this. And I don't fully disagree with that. And this is why. Because I don't see the active imagination as just disclosing the unconscious in an objective sense, as I've been talking about. It's not just simply revealing something that already exists. Rather, active imagination is a form of participation in and with the archetypes of the collective unconscious. So active imagination is a form of what Jorge Ferrer calls participatory knowing. So now I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey through the history of the philosophical and spiritual notion of participation. And I'll be doing that by drawing on several important figures in the philosophical tradition, beginning with Plato. So this idea of participation elucidates the relationship between the divine, humanity, and the world. And there have been three major shifts in the history of Western philosophy regarding divine participation with humanity and the world. And I'm speaking within the Western philosophical tradition because that's my own lineage and what I've been educated within. But I think these concepts can be broadened out and explored from other philosophical traditions. So I'm simply sharing what at this point I have studied and understand, but I wouldn't say that this is definitely doesn't need to be seen as universal. And I'm drawing a lot of these ideas from a book called The Participatory Turn, which was edited by Jacob Sherman and Jorge Ferrer. Ferrer is the one I've already mentioned, who talks about participatory spirituality. Jacob Sherman was actually my dissertation chair, so I've learned a great deal from him. And these three participatory turns in the last 2,500 years of philosophy are, the first turn is what we would call the formal participation of Plato. And I'll explain what that means momentarily. The second turn is the existential or causal participation of Thomas Aquinas. And finally, the third turn is the creative participation of Friedrich Schelling. And all three inform what we might think of as a fourth participatory turn that has been taking place in transpersonal psychology and participatory spirituality. So for Plato, it's from Plato that we get the initial articulation of archetypes. And Jung is very much drawing on Plato, although with more than 2,000 years separating them, the idea of what archetypes are has evolved immensely. But Plato held the idea that the world was informed, the material world was informed by what were called ideas, ideas with a capital I, or forms with a capital F. These archetypal principles that dwelt in a transcendent, eternal realm, and that the material world participated in that realm. So as an example, all horses participate in the form or the idea of horseness. You can think of that with a capital H. Or all trees participate in the archetype of treeness. So you can see why it's called the formal participation, because they partake in the form of tree or horse or home, or maybe to use a more complex one, beauty. Anything that we perceive as beautiful, a flower, the sunset, a landscape, a beloved's face, participates in the form of beauty. Beauty informs it. And Plato saw the participation between this transcendent realm of forms and the material realm of particulars. Remember before I was talking about the history of participation is just looking at how universals and particulars relate. And the relationship between those two worlds, Plato called methexis, Methexix, methexis. And that this is how these two separate but related worlds interact. And the whole world unconsciously participates in these forms. The tree unconsciously participates in the form of treeness. But it is the spiritual journey of human philosophers to learn to consciously participate in the forms through what Plato called anamnesis, which just translates as unforgetting. We unforget or remember from our pre-incarnated existence what the realm of forms was like. And so as philosophers, it can be our journey to return to that archetypal perception. And Plato saw a realm. He called this realm the metaxy, Metaxy, the metaxy. It's a world that connects the human world to the world of the gods. And in that realm, that intermediate realm, daemons carry messages back and forth between humans and the gods. Now, one such daemon is Eros. Eros being love. So love is one of the mediators between the human realm and the realm of the gods. And there are many other such daemons, but one of them is Eros. So this mediating realm in Platonic philosophy actually informs the Sufi notion of the mundus imaginalis that I brought up before. They are related. Platonic philosophy went on to inform Sufi mysticism, among many other various streams. So that's the first participatory turn, the formal participatory relationship between the transcendent realm of forms or archetypes and the material world. And now, several centuries later, we will come to the existential participatory turn. Existential just meaning existence, of Thomas Aquinas. And for Aquinas, he is approaching this topic more from a religious perspective, from a Christian perspective. Plato is addressing the question of what a being is. What is its form? What a being is. But Thomas is asking a different question. He's asking, why does that being exist? Why does it exist at all? This is why it's the existential participatory turn. And Thomas Aquinas saw creation as a gift bestowed by God. So he called this causal participation. God causes a being to exist. Existence, our own existence, the existence of all of the world, it's a gift from God in Thomas Aquinas' perspective, and therefore does not belong to the created being. So from his perspective, God overflows God's self, and each being is the limited potency of an infinite act of God. So God is infinite, and each one of us exist from this perspective because we participate in that overflowing abundance of God. And therefore, that is where our core existence comes from. We limit that infinite act of God within each of ourselves, and that is why we are. And this shows an interesting distinction between Plato's time and Thomas Aquinas' time, because infinity for the ancient Greek mind meant pure chaos. For something to be divine, for something to be perfect to the ancient Greek mind, it needs to be limited. It needs to be bound. This is the difference between a cosmos, in the Greek sense, cosmos, which is ordered beauty, and chaos. But with the influence of the Hebraic tradition, the Alexandrian mystery religions, that idea of what the divine is starts to evolve and moves from being finite but perfect to being infinite. And so by the time we come to medieval Christianity, God is seen as infinite. And it is God's infinity that allows our finite created beings to exist. So neither of these two forms of participation at this point account for human creativity. And the recognition of human creativity and agency is what instigates the third participatory turn. And it's the idea that human creativity participates in God's creativity. So this is taking it one step further. Human creativity is finite, God's is infinite, but we partake in that creativity nonetheless. To use the language of J.R.R. Tolkien, he says, we make in our measure and derivative mode because we are made, and not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. That's J.R.R. Tolkien reflecting on this concept. So the third participatory turn, which is really articulated by Friedrich Schelling, one of the German idealists. He speaks of panentheism. And this is the idea that God is within nature, but also transcending it. And you may or may not have heard this term before, panentheism. It's contrasted with pantheism. Pantheism was a philosophical concept brought forward by Spinoza. Spinoza basically argued that God and nature are one. That is what pantheism means. All is God. God is all. But with that equation, it's no longer participatory because there's no relationship between realms. So for there to be participation, you need a relationship. You need realms. And so Spinoza's pantheism is not participatory. So Schelling creates his idea of panentheism, which has that little N in there. So not God is all, but God in all. So the idea that God is within nature, but then also transcending it. And as I mentioned, human creativity is then a participation in God's creativity. Now, I won't unpack this too much further because Schelling's philosophy is wonderfully complex, but just to bring forward the idea that there are three powers in God. One is centripetal, one is centrifugal, so one moving inward, one moving outward, and then there's this third creative tension, like a universal soul linking nature and spirit. And it is this creative tension that gives rise to the creativity, both of God and of the human being. So I want to introduce one more thinker here into our history of the notion of participation. And this is the ideas of Owen Barfield. Now, Owen Barfield was maybe best known as one of the Oxford Inklings. And the Inklings were a literary group, informal literary group, of such figures as C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and several other individuals that came together in the 1930s, 1940s in Oxford to share their ideas, their writings, both philosophical and fictional and poetic. And Barfield was informed in his ideas by German and English Romanticism, but especially by Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. And Barfield's thought embraces all three forms of participation that I've been talking about: formal, existential, and creative. And Barfield articulates the idea of an evolution of consciousness. These are ideas he's drawing from Steiner, among others. An evolution of consciousness from original to final participation. So to give an example of how Barfield speaks about participation, he gives the example of a rainbow. So we look at a rainbow, dazzling, glimmering in all its colors, and we have to ask the question, is the rainbow really there? Because when we go down to the particulates of it, the drop of water, the light hitting it, our own eyes in relationship to it, can we really say the rainbow as an entity is there? And so what Barfield says is that our perception of the rainbow is a shared collective representation. Shared collective representation. So a representation for Barfield is something that we perceive to be there. A rainbow, a tree, a house, anything that we perceive with the senses. And so a representation for Barfield is a phenomenon in its wholeness, so not reducible to its parts. He thinks of those parts, those particles, which are what scientists claim are what the world really is before human perception of it. Barfield calls those particles the unrepresented. So he differentiates it from the phenomenon or from the represented. And our representations or representations in the world, they're perceived not only with our physical senses, so seeing, touch, smell, hearing. Yes, they're perceived with that, but they're also perceived with mental habits, with memory, with imagination, with feeling. All of that is in participatory relationship with the world. So for Barfield, participation is this sensory, and again, by sensory, I don't just mean physical, I mean imagination, memory, feeling, sensory relationship between the human being and the phenomena of the world, like the rainbow. So the world as we know it, a world filled with rainbows and sunbeams and the song of birds, the world as we know it is created by participation in that world. And Barfield articulates this idea of original participation. It's what the anthropologist Lévi-Brul calls the participation mystique, in which human beings experience themselves as seamlessly interwoven with a world of ensouled sacred meaning. So that connection of participation is perceived by the human subject. And they can therefore sense that link between the perceiver and the representation. So I'll give an example of this. Barfield traces this through language. And he looks at ancient languages, such as Latin or Sanskrit and ancient Greek, and looks at how words are used in poetry. And usually when we think of poetry, we think of it using language as metaphor. So the example, one of the examples he brings forward is the Latin word spiritus, which now we would translate as spirit, but also we could translate it as breath, we could translate it as wind. And so it has all these separate definitions. And for us, with our consciousness, we usually think of the wind as being something distinct from spirit, which is something distinct from breath. But Barfield argues these are not just metaphors in the sense that some ancient thinker extrapolated long ago and said, oh, the breath is a good metaphor for spirit. I'll use that in my poetry. No, what he is saying is that the word spiritus to the ancient speaker of that word actually conveys all of those meanings at once. Spiritus means breath and wind and spirit simultaneously. And so the kind of consciousness that perceives spirit in the wind, or that can look up at the physical planets and perceive them as the home of the gods, can look at Venus and know that Venus is ensouled as the archetype of love and beauty and desire and romance and aesthetics and the artistic. That is just known to that ancient form of consciousness, to original participation. And the evolution of consciousness that Barfield is speaking about is one in which that participation in the world in that way slowly withdraws. And as it withdraws, it forges this sense of an individual self. No longer is meaning seamlessly flowing through from the human to the world and from the world back to the human, but rather human beings in a modern consciousness become the soul center of meaning, purpose, consciousness. And the world lacks those things. It is simply material. It is purposeless. And if we take that thinking far enough, as some scientists do today, they will even argue that human beings don't have that consciousness or purpose or meaning. Human beings are just simply genes and neurons firing and nothing more. And while we could take up a whole very interesting discussion around that, I will just respond by sharing a quote from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who says, "Scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they are purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study." So that isn't what we're doing here. I don't want to take this so far that we erase all meaning and purpose, not just from the world, but also from ourselves. Rather, I want to continue that evolution that Barfield is pointing toward. And instead of a full withdrawal and finally erasure of ensouled meaning, we come to what Barfield called final participation. Now, Barfield turned to Christianity for this, but I prefer a more pluralistic view of religion and spirituality to answer what this final participation looks like. And so this brings me to contemporary transpersonal theory. And this segment of my talk may be the most complex in terms of terms, but I will try to make it simple and accessible and digestible. But basically, transpersonal psychology is a branch of psychology that accounts for the spiritual dimension of human experience. And it's certainly informed by Jung's analytical psychology. That's one of the many streams informing it. But it's differentiated from many other kinds of psychology that do not account for the spiritual dimension of human experience. And that term transpersonal, it simply refers to the fact that we as human beings can experience phenomena that are beyond the personal or the individual. That in our internal experiences, we can encounter what could be perceived as gods or archetypes, that we can have experiences beyond that which is informed simply by the sensory experiences of our individual biographical lives. I think we all know that we can have these kinds of experiences, but you would be amazed by how many people argue that we don't, or that it's simply a pathology or something has gone terribly wrong. So early transpersonal theory, coming out of transpersonal psychology and spirituality, it does still carry several traits of the modern paradigm, and really initiated by Descartes, carried forward by Kant, and so forth. For example, the experientialist perspective. And by that, I just simply mean that all spiritual experiences, all mystical experiences, are inclusively individual and internal. So I can have a spiritual experience, but that has no bearing on the world, on anybody else. And that's one way that one could view what happened in Jung's Red Book. It's a very personal experience, but has no bearing on revealing any information about the larger nature of reality. So that's what is called the experientialist perspective. It also is carrying vestiges of saying, for example, that spiritual experiences objectively reveal empirical knowledge, meaning I can have a disclosure of the divine, and then I can come out from that and say, this is reality, and it's the only reality. So if I have a direct experience of, say, the Christian God, from this perspective, it's saying that that is the only God. And then there's also vestiges carried of the perennialist perspective. Perennialism is a term coined by Aldous Huxley. And this is that a pre-given universal spirituality underlies all religious traditions, meaning there is a true universal religion or spirituality that all other religions are pointing towards, but have not yet accessed. And a couple common metaphors for this are a mountain, spiritual mountain with many paths, and all the world's religions are those different paths going toward this pinnacle at the top, which is considered to be the ultimate spiritual reality. Or another example that I think is helpful for this is the metaphor of many blind men each touching an elephant. And they're each describing a different part of the elephant. One has the trunk, one has the tail, one has the foot, one has the ear. They're all describing something radically different. And so that's an illustration of the perennialist perspective, which is saying each of the religious traditions is describing their ear, foot, tail, trunk of the elephant. But none of them have the full picture. And perennialism suggests that at the top of the hierarchy are the people who have had disclosed the full picture. They recognize, oh, this is an elephant, and this is just simply revealing different parts of it. So the thinker who I've been really influenced by in engaging with transpersonal psychology and spirituality is the scholar I keep mentioning, Jorge Ferrer. And he wrote a book about 20 years ago now called Revisioning Transpersonal Theory. He wanted to revision this. And basically what he suggests is that, and I remember the first time I heard him say this in class with that metaphor of the elephant, he said, there is no elephant. And I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. What do you mean there's no elephant? What do you mean there's no pre-given spiritual reality that we're all trying to discover? But what he didn't mean was there is no elephant and nothing else is there. A better metaphor, and this just came to me last night as I was contemplating it. Imagine approaching a still pool of water that you cannot perceive, and your finger touches it. And as you touch that still pool of water, ripples form. And in your perception of the ripples, suddenly you know the water is there. Now you would come away from that experience saying, water ripples, or God is the ripple, or the divine is the ripple. But what you need to remember, there are two agencies here. There's your finger and there's the water. And your finger touching it is the human co-creative participatory engagement with the indeterminate spiritual mystery, which is the water. And so what Ferrer describes is that such experiences, transpersonal phenomena, as he calls them, they are participatory events. So they're not just individual experiences, they are events that can emerge on multiple levels of human experience. They can be individual, but they can be relational, they can be communal, they can be collective, and so forth. They are co-creative, multi-local, multi-dimensional. And this is a quote from him, they are enacted through intentional or spontaneous creative participation in an indeterminate spiritual power or mystery. So that differentiation of being enacted through intentional or spontaneous creative participation, you can apply that to Jung's experiences in that the flood vision was the spontaneous creative participation. It just came to him. But it can also be intentional, which is what eventually was developed for him through the practice of active imagination. He would intentionally sit down night after night and engage in these practices. Both are enacting the experiences he is having, but one is spontaneous and the other is intentional. So when we apply this idea to understanding Jung's experiences with the Red Book, when we apply this idea to understanding what the archetypes of the collective unconscious are, first of all, we need to look at this history I've laid out, that Jung's notion of archetypes evolved from Plato's. But there are major differences. For Plato, the archetypes are ontological divine entities, real existing divine entities dwelling in a transcendent realm. For Jung, especially earlier Jung, archetypes are psychological realities that are culturally and biologically inherited. Now, later in his work, as he really started to account for synchronicity, he recognized that they actually may also be a priori principles grounded in the cosmos, not just in the human intrasubjective experience. This actually breaks down that experientialist wall that I was talking about before in terms of transpersonal theory. So from a participatory perspective, what I'm bringing forward here is that archetypes are cosmic potentials, and they're also culturally and individually enacted. and inherited psychologically, spiritually, through religion, and in mythic form. They are both. So this entire thesis is really about just walking between two different ways. Are we saying, is it transcendent? Is it immanent? Well, it's both. And it arises from the interaction of both. Now, Ferrer says that that indeterminate spiritual mystery cannot be depicted with positive attributes. There is no elephant. We can't describe an elephant. So we can't say that the indeterminate spiritual mystery is non-dual or impersonal or personal. All those descriptors are already enactions. But I do want to suggest, and in conversation, his thought has come toward agreeing with this, that if we can give one positive attribute to the spiritual mystery, it would be to say that it is archetypally patterned, because archetypes are diverse and flexible and encompassing enough that we can see their patterning, and yet they are still indeterminate. Archetypes are indeterminate. And so they have a coherence of form, and yet they also come into form ever anew. So carrying forward this perspective that the indeterminate spiritual mystery is nonetheless patterned with non-determined archetypal potentials, I wish to turn and start bringing toward a conclusion how carrying this view holds implications for the practice of active imagination, and how the faculty of human imagination itself participates in the spiritual mystery. So Jung asked for a sign that the spirit of the depths was the ruler of the outer world. He asked for this sign, and the answer he got was that flood vision, prophesying the war. So there's a synchronicity here. Synchronicity separated by 9 months, but between an inner event, the flood vision, and the outer event of the war breaking out. This is what initiated him to start writing down his fantasies. He came into an argument with an inner voice about what he was doing. He said, "What am I doing here?" And the voice said, "This is art." He said, "This is not art." He was very resistant to the idea that what he was doing was art. And in commencing this internal dialogue, this was the beginning for him of active imagination, lending his voice to a figure that he could feel was independent from him and yet arising through him. As I've mentioned, active imagination has deep roots. For example, in Neoplatonism, Plotinus called this practice contemplation. It can be understood as a form of theurgy or God work. And this practice for the Neoplatonists could give rise to a vision of the Platonic archetypes. Very much what we're talking about here with Jung, but instead of in psychological language, it's in spiritual and philosophical language. And one would do this by contemplating a symbol that would connect the physical and spiritual worlds. So symbols, from this perspective, and Jung would agree with this, symbols are how archetypes clothe themselves. Symbols are not just human constructs. They are embodiments of divinity. Symbols are discovered, not constructed. Now, I would say symbols are not just discovered objectively, they are enacted. They are called forth. So when we hold this view coming out of Neoplatonism in accord with this participatory epistemology that I've been laying out, this challenges the notion that spiritual truths are pre-existent and determined. So this participatory perspective views disclosures such as this as genuine spiritual truths, but it doesn't privilege these disclosures hierarchically above other spiritual truths enacted by different religions, by different spiritual means. Rather, it affirms the reality of these symbols. So it isn't saying these are just human constructs. It affirms the reality of the symbols as one of many infinite expressions of divinity. So the archetypal forms, they're not predetermined, but rather they take on new shape and form with every spiritual encounter. with every inaction. And that this can be applied to understanding religions and spiritual traditions, and also to understanding psychological practice or Jung's experience with the Red Book. So active imagination for Jung, which could be compared to Neoplatonic theurgy, to Jewish kavana, to Christian mystical contemplation, to Sufi meditation, to trance states, these are all forms of what can be called participatory knowing. And that this isn't a mental representation of pre-given independent spiritual objects. I know I keep going back over that point to kind of drive it home, but rather it's an enaction or bringing forth of a spiritual world or a domain. And active imagination, this practice, it draws on many ways of knowing: intellectual, emotional, sensual, somatic, visionary, our intuitive capacities. All of these are brought to bear through active imagination to elicit from the collective unconscious an inner world that is as complex and diverse and infinite as the outer world. So I want to share a beautiful passage from Jung's Red Book in which he speaks of this world. He says, "If you look outside yourselves, you see the far-off forest and mountains, and above them your vision climbs to the realms of the stars. And if you look into yourselves, you will see, on the other hand, the nearby as far off and infinite, since the world of the inner is as infinite as the world of the outer. This inner world is truly infinite, in no way poorer than the outer one. Man lives in two worlds, or the human being lives in two worlds." So Jung brought his imagination into this co-creative participatory relationship with the archetypal principles of the collective unconscious. And in doing that, he was able to enact imaginal persons such as Elijah and Salome and Philemon, and landscapes such as the desert or the forest or the sea. And these were a co-creation with these indeterminate archetypal agencies. So in this, we are affirming the reality of the archetypes and the collective unconscious, but not claiming that the form we experience them in is entirely independent and objective. Human beings and archetypes both have creative agency. And this living imaginal reality that is enacted, it's neither fully objective nor subjective. It's enactive and participatory, as I've been saying. It's a realm in between. It's the middle realm, what Plato called the metaxy, or the Sufi mundus imaginalis, the world of the imagination. The mundus imaginalis is as real as the world of the senses and the world of the intellect. And the mundus imaginalis itself is a spiritually enacted world. So one that's been returned to repeatedly by imaginal journeyers through the centuries. And to give a metaphor that Ferrer draws forward, he speaks of a forest. You could think of the forest like yet another metaphor to try and understand this indeterminate but archetypally patterned spiritual mystery. Metaphor of a forest with many paths. And the various religious traditions are those paths. And it's easier to tread a path that's already been walked by someone else. The mundus imaginalis, that world or domain, can be seen as one such path. Now, this metaphor draws on Evan Thompson, coming out of cognitive science, Evan Thompson's image for enaction, which is laying down a path in walking. If you think about that, the path doesn't exist until you walk it. Laying down a path and walking. So I believe that the realm that Jung encountered in his fantasies that he recorded in the Red Book through active imagination, I believe that that's comparable to the mundus imaginalis, this co-created imaginal world populated with personifications of the archetypal powers of the spiritual mystery. and the figures that Jung encountered. So Elijah, Salome, the serpent, the old scholar and his young daughter, the cook and the librarian, the devil and the anchorite, most importantly, the old sage and magician Philemon. They all can be understood as these co-created beings of the imaginal realm, these what James Hillman calls figures from the middle world. They reflect archetypal principles, but they're also very personal to Jung. And they're coming to him in a guise and a form that's a creative response to his own personal psychology, biography, culture, history, and situated experience. So I would say that the imaginal realm may just be another name for Plato's metaxy, but one that has been articulated some centuries later. Liz Green, the astrologer and Jungian psychologist who wrote 2 amazing books on Jung's relationship to astrology, she identifies these imaginal figures that Jung encounters as daemons, not as personality traits. And she illuminates the astrological archetypes standing behind these daemons, which reflect the universal astrological principles, but also Jung's own birth chart. And I think this is a perfect example of this co-creative enaction, because a birth chart is a unique expression. We each have an individual birth chart. It's a unique expression of universal principles. So we all are born with the same planets in our natal chart, but they are configured in entirely unique ways. So the Red Book is a record of Jung's participatory enactions in relation to the archetypal principles of the collective unconscious. And this work, the Red Book, reflects multiple levels of meaning, definitely relevant to Jung as an individual, as well as the greater whole of humanity, because it demonstrates how universal archetypal principles can take unique form and impart genuine wisdom in the guise of imaginal figures of the mundus imaginalis. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that another name may be needed for the collective unconscious. And I did at that time suggest perhaps the mundus imaginalis, that when we bring the contents of the collective unconscious into consciousness, we can understand them as the mundus imaginalis. But I would say they shouldn't be equated, because the mundus imaginalis, as I've been talking about, is itself enacted, is itself elicited forth. We perceive that world of the imagination when we bring the unconscious contents into our conscious awareness. And so in holding these metaphors together, these different perspectives together, how does this relate, the collective unconscious, to the indeterminate spiritual mystery? And I would say perhaps the collective unconscious itself is that indeterminate spiritual mystery. And this is when we have to perceive the collective unconscious not as simply a repository for repressed material, but indeed as an entire world, as the anima mundi, the world soul. And if we can call the collective unconscious the anima mundi, and know that all religions, all spiritual paths, all mythologies, all imaginal worlds known to humanity are enacted in co-creation between us and the anima mundi, what does that give rise to in our imagination? How do we hold that full perspective that allows this plurality of religious and mystical experiences without reducing them to one form of truth, but rather to a plurality of truths? So in conclusion, Jung wrote this extraordinary statement in the Red Book. It's probably my favorite line in the Red Book. He says, "To give birth to the ancient in a new time is creation. The task is to give birth to the old in a new time." And I would say that Jung undertook this task by engaging in this co-creative practice of active imagination, to bring forward a new disclosure of the archetypal mystery, a new disclosure of the anima mundi in his time. And he enacted this through the fantasies of the Red Book. And this is what became the foundational principles of analytical psychology. All right. Thank you so much for going on that philosophical journey with me. I would love to open up to questions and dialogue. I'm sure there probably are questions about some of the specifics or technicalities of some of these terms. So thank you for bearing with all of that. And I hope that some of it sticks and starts to illuminate your own understanding of your own experiences. I think that's one of the most important ways to apply this, but also the psychologists out there, how you see the experiences of your patients, how we understand our different religious perspectives and spiritual worldviews. So thank you so much. And
wow, Becca, that was breathtaking. I think there's a lot of people both on YouTube and on the Zoom call here and we've had up to 85 at one point, who have had our breaths taken away from us by your talk. It's been extraordinary. And, some people were claiming, please slow down, I can't keep up. And fortunately, there will be a replay of this presentation, so we'll be able to re-listen to it multiple times. But oh my God, I do have some questions, and I think there is one that I have to put at the head of the line, and then we'll turn to others. But that question relates to any caveats that you would give about doing active imagination and its risks. And I wonder if you'd address that issue.
Definitely. So active imagination is a practice that I think it comes very easily to some people, and it's more of a struggle for others. It just depends how easily one can suspend that critical faculty. But I hold it on a par in terms of a practice that offers experiential access. I hold it in the same kind of category as psychedelic work, working with sacred medicines, something like holotropic breath work as created by Stanislav Grof, which comes out of doing psychedelic work, and see them all as related. But with active imagination, especially compared to the other two, particularly sacred medicines, you can stop the experience. With holotropic breath work, you can too. You simply stop the deep breathing and you eventually return to a more ordinary state of consciousness. But active imagination is engaging with a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And for some people, they're especially sensitive to that. And so there is a danger to it. Jung would describe this as there's the danger of being taken too far away from consensus reality. And in any of these practices, what is so important is how to come back to your embodied experience. I think it really does come down to coming back to the body. And for Jung, he had many things that helped to keep him coming back, bridging between realms. And all of these things helped assure him that he was, in fact, a sane, functioning person, that he wasn't psychotic, which he was very afraid might be happening, because he had no context for this. He was raised in a worldview and educated in a worldview that denied that these kinds of experiences could be healthy. Now, a century later, I think we're having very different conversations, but we still need to be very respectful of what opening up this bridge to another realm can initiate. And so I think working with others in a group, with an analyst, with a guide is so essential to be able to come back. And for Jung, it was having his practice, teaching, although he started dropping off, teaching more and more while he was in the midst of this experience, military service, his family. And I would say probably above all, his relationship with Toni Wolff, who really did act as a guide and a container and a mirror in which to reflect these experiences. And she had such a trust in the unconscious, in the psyche, that she was able to be a ground for him, that that these experiences were real, were possible, could be understood and integrated. And so it's actually the pair of them that really does create Jung's Red Book. And what's fascinating about Toni Wolff is she couldn't do active imagination, but she could hold space for someone else doing it, for Jung, for her analysans so well, this extraordinary container. But she couldn't do it herself. And so that, I think, can be the biggest danger, is really learning how to safely come back. And embodied practices, experiences, yoga, breath work, things that remind you have a body are essential.
Yeah, certainly. I don't agree that it's essential to have an analyst, but I do agree that it's essential to have grounding.
Yes.
I've never
Totally.
had an analyst, but I've had plenty of things to ground me over time. So
Yeah.
and grounding is essential, and I think that this is much safer than hallucinogenic drugs. Funnily, someone on here says hello from Medellin, Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to be careful about the fact that we, 1 year recently, maybe 2018, we had 72,000 people die from opioids.
Mm-hmm.
And there are opioid experiments going on in major teaching hospitals like Johns Hopkins, but those certainly should be done under professional supervision. And if you go out and go doing it on your own, you're taking a real risk with your very life. And I personally have lost 3 people in my immediate family or knowledge that have died in the last 3 years, and I think many people have. So, these are issues that I think we need to be cognizant about and keep in mind. But anyway, let me open it up to others for questions, and then I'll come back if need be. And I'm going to put you on gallery view so that everybody can see one another. And I would ask that, if at all possible, you could open your video so that we can show how many people are actually here, because sometimes with all these closed videos, it looks like there were only 3 or 4 people here, when in fact there have been 85 people here at one point. And so we have a lot of people present listening to what you say. And so just open your mic and go ahead and ask your question. If it gets chaotic, we'll go to hand raising. Joss has raised her hand, so we'll go to Joss first. Joss is a retired psychiatrist in Hawaii. Go ahead, Joss.
Aloha, Becca. Absolutely beautiful. Your whole presentation was an art in itself. And I know you put in a lot of work and creativity in it, and we all here are very, very appreciative of your wonderful presentation. If Thomas Aquinas is here, and he probably is, he would say, you're a gift.
Oh, thank you.
And I must say, too, that I think you enacted the anima mundus by your mere presentation. In fact, I was thinking, while I was looking at you, you talked about looking at an image for a long time. Well, we looked at your image for two hours, or close to 2 hours. So my imagination brought up Philemon and Sophia together as a blend. You presented the archetype and bringing the message, the metaxis from the gods of the beautiful message that we are all one, that we are all reflections of archetypes, and that it can be can be activated or enacted when we have our, groundedness and our intention to go deeper within. And however, like I agree with Skip, as well as you, Becca, and a few others probably here listening in who are professionals, that yes, we do recommend that if one plans to try this active participation, to do it with people that are a little bit more knowledgeable and in groups and have a support system to do so. But anyway, thank you so much. And I just wanted to express my appreciation and my active imagination that you brought forth. Thank you so much, Becca. Aloha.
Oh, thank you. I'm just very touched by your response and a little overwhelmed by it. And it was a pleasure to get to bring forward these ideas. And I will reiterate on what both of you are bringing forward, that active imagination is something to take very seriously. And I think one of the most effective ways that I've witnessed it be used is in the group context. It can be in a group with a guide, where one is simply led into a visualization experience. And again, if it feels like too much or overwhelming, one can simply open their eyes and step away. Now, if one is more sensitive like Jung, then clearly something is coming through here. And that is when it's so important to draw on others for support and as a help. And just to clarify, and bringing forward sacred medicines or psychedelics, I'm not by any means suggesting opioids either in that category. And I won't bring that too much into this talk, but the research on psychedelic psychotherapy within a medical responsible container does have extraordinary effects. But I think for individuals who are wanting to engage with that kind of psychospiritual transformation without any mediation of a substance, that is what's so extraordinary about something like active imagination or something like holotropic breathwork, which, to be honest, I think is a more embodied form of something like active imagination. It brings them together and the breath kind of carries you through it. So I would encourage people, first of all, just to research more. If you're totally new to this idea of active imagination, read what Jung wrote on it, and read what other psychologists have written about it, and see too how active imagination is related to dream work, but also different. Dream work being more of that passive, receptive form of being in relationship to the archetypes, whereas active imagination being more in the waking conscious world.
Yeah, I just observed that active imagination is also what does happen to artists of all kinds in their creativity, so that when the novelist has writer's block, it's because they can't get to that imaginal realm again that they were in. And I was actually in that realm once for 8 months without benefit of being a psychiatrist or psychologist. And I was being visited by beings every morning that were waking me up and making me write. And I wrote this novel out, and then it contained some things that I didn't particularly want to address at that moment in time. But I know the experience of writing something from the unconscious that obviously to me is what the great novelists did experience. And when they then die of alcoholism or drug overdoses, it's because they've been trying to get back to that situation and they weren't able to. And so it's better to understand the process and not have it just overwhelming, which it did to me. I mean, I thought I was writing a novel, and then all of a sudden, bango, this started to happen to me. And it was archetypal. It would not stop until the novel was finished, until I had told this story completely. Then it stopped, but it didn't stop until that happened. And you know, for somebody who has a best-selling novel, that's a great thing. But you know, you need to understand that what's going on. And at the time, I didn't. I mean, for me, it was, in a sense, overwhelming. I was possessed, but now, in the fullness of time, I do understand it as this imaginal realm, and so now I could get myself back, but it took it's taken nearly 30 years to get fully conscious of that. And so I really, really appreciate this presentation. Others, I'm sorry, I hogged time here. Other comments?
Yeah, I'd like to actually, I was going the same way you are in terms of being an artist, because I consider myself a sacred and visionary artist. Psychology, spirituality have always been deeply embedded in all my processes. But you know, when you talk about a container for it, you know, when you're working with a tangible, earthy medium, it's a great way to be grounded. I mean, you've literally got a paintbrush in your hand, you've got the canvas underneath you. There's the sensual participation of moving the paint, and you have an intention, you move the paint and something reveals itself. And as all of that's going on, there's also this conversation. And I know a lot of artists in my, you know, sort of my school of thought about it, we often talk about it's more than imposing your vision on it, but like the download comes, there's this moment like a thumbnail sketch, and you enter into that imaginal realm, then it becomes a dialogue. And a lot of times I have just a vague idea of where I'm going, but as the paint, the participation, the enactment goes on, it becomes clearer and clearer. There's a story, there's a dialogue, there'll be revelations along the way. And again, it is, for me, is a very safe container, because it creates these sensory boundaries, you know, where I know that I'm going back and forth. So I just would like to suggest that as a way that you can be working alone and safely engaged with that grounding mechanism in place.
Definitely. What a wonderful example. And it's such an act of surrender, that creative process, and the recognition that it's something coming through you. And that takes the pressure off too, where, you know, if we think about that third creative turn, the third creative participatory turn, where it's the recognition that human creativity is a participation in the creativity of the divine. That realization accounts for how artistic inspiration can come through us, but is not sourced in us as individual human beings. That idea of genius, it's another evolution we could trace, where a genius is originally the spirit that moves one. And now we refer to individual human beings as geniuses, which would make no sense to the original users of that word. And this is exactly what Jung recommended in terms of the practice of active imagination. So you have the experience, but then an essential part of the experience is objectifying what comes forth by writing it down, by painting it. This is why the Red Book is what it is. It's filled with extraordinary paintings and beautiful writing, because this is how he captured what had come forward. Otherwise, it is ephemeral. It sinks back into the unconscious. You could almost say it becomes unenacted unless we bring it into this realm. And then it is the participation of at least three different agencies. You have the archetypal or divine agency, our own human agency, and then the agency of the material world. The example you're bringing forward, the paint, the paper, the physicality of it. And so as human creators, we're situated in between, and we're bringing in the vision, but then by the time it's on the page or written out, it's not necessarily what we thought we were willing. And it's also different than the primordial archetype that was first coming through us.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that Jung was doing creative things throughout his life, from like age 10 or younger. And one of the important things that he mentions in the Red Book, so it's advice to all of us, is he at the last piece of the first section, I think, right before soul and God, he says, "My friends, it is wise to nourish the soul. Excuse me. Otherwise, you will breed dragons and devils in your heart." And that's an incredibly important idea, because it says that all of us have to do something creative in order to keep from breeding dragons and devils in our hearts. Penelope, did you have a question? Someone mentioned.
I do. That was so beautiful, Becca. Really stunning work that you laid out there. Thank you. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, but I think I'm fascinated listening to you on YouTube over the last couple of years, different YouTubes I've heard of yours. With Neptune, and what's helped to ground me is actually understanding my own chart. And I'm fascinated with the use that Jung used astrology to understand the psyche. And I think that the Neptune, as an example, with the Neptune, I have in 12 on the South Node. So not going into astrology, but understanding how we use our Neptune and Pluto, and the study of our own chart can really take us to a new level in our own imagination of, and in our dream realm as well. It can be fascinating to study and look at our own charts.
On YouTube, Miles is saying we need group support to live in today's reality, even without going into any active imaginations. And there was a very humorous statement that Nancy made, which was, "We're all like oysters trying to describe a ballerina."
That's great. Yeah, I just to come back to your point, Penelope, I do think that astrology can provide us with a map, a cartography to understand our particular relationship to the archetypal principles. And I'll mention here that in a couple months, October 23rd, I am giving another talk for the Comox Jung Society on Jung's relationship to astrology. So if you want to go more deeply into that, I'll be speaking about that subject specifically then, and his chart, his transits during the Red Book period. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
That'll be very interesting. Okay, other points here.
Hi, Becca. That was really a fantastic talk. It's Stephen here. Hi. You referenced the English Romantics, and I was really, or the Romantics, German and English. I was really struck reading the Red Book. It reminded me very much of Blake's work, which I have an example behind me, in the combination of word and image. And Blake writes so much about the imagination, and actually invites the viewer in his descriptive catalogue to enter into his visions and his images on the fiery chariot of their imagination. And of course, he's dismissed as a poor lunatic by some of his contemporaries, but still sort of keeps true to that vision.
Absolutely. I think some of the great standing behind Jung's Red Book project are Blake, Nietzsche's Zarathustra, of course Goethe's Faust, and then Dante's Divine Comedy. Like those four are the quartet that kind of stands behind what Jung's Red Book is.
Yeah. And just on, just one more point. I always found, I think it's Coleridge makes the distinction between fantasy and imagination, which I've always found quite useful, that the imagination is the reality, as it were, as Blake says it is. For Coleridge, fantasy is the made up stuff.
Yes, Coleridge has this very helpful distinction between the primary imagination, which you can almost think of as the imagination of God. The secondary imagination was like the human creative imagination. And then what he calls fancy, which is kind of the unreal. And Tolkien actually wanted to use that same delineation, but he wants to reclaim the word fantasy. And I think both Jung and Tolkien reclaim that word fantasy from the degradation of fancy as Coleridge used it. And that delineation, I think, is so helpful. Probably my favorite quote ever is when Coleridge says, "The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am." And that statement just stands behind everything that I tried to present here today.
That's a great one. Thank you. Thank you very much again.
Thank you too. I saw another hand. Yes. Henning?
Well, I did promise Becca that we would limit this to about 2 hours, and I do think that there's one topic that is important for all of us. So I'd like to ask this question, and unless someone else speaks up, then
I can go for probably 10 more minutes,
okay.
And then I do have to depart.
Okay. Well, this question may take 10 minutes, but
okay.
But in the context of the collective unconscious, I have always been interested in Jung because of his implications for our collective society. And I wonder if you'd speak to the issue of how we create our society, where we co-create our societies, and how that is a reflection of us, whether we're, regardless of our political position. So would you like to address that, or you want to avoid that one?
No, I would love to address it. It's a huge question, and one I feel I can only just kind of talk around in some ways. It's what initially drew me toward wanting to understand worldviews and the collective unconscious, the imagination, astrology, depth psychology, all of that was ecology, actually. My whole journey that led into this inner realm in some ways was initiated by working on a farm and being very connected to the earth, the soil, the plants, the animals, working for 2 weeks in 116-degree heat, and recognizing at an embodied level that climate change is real. This happened in my late teens, and this started to open up these questions for me of how is it possible that we as a civilization have initiated an ecological crisis? And this brought me on the journey of wanting to understand the evolution of worldviews. And it actually brought me into learning the work that my father, Richard Tarnas, had been writing. So I hadn't been interested in his work up until this point, and suddenly was drawn in. And he writes about the evolution of worldviews. And in engaging with that work, I recognize that we can only be in an ecological crisis if we live in a world that doesn't see the earth, the cosmos, as ensouled, as having meaning and purpose. not just any, but at least as much as our own, and very likely even more. And so I think that right now our civilization is reaching, hopefully, what's the peak or the nadir of a crisis, that is showing that that way of treating the world is not sustainable. The way of treating the world as an object cannot last, it cannot endure, and a civilization that tries to do that will crumble. And and so I actually do see this work of engaging the imaginal, engaging the ensouled, moving toward what Barfield would call final participation, as not just returning soul to the world, because it's not just our agency, but learning to perceive again that the world itself is animated by the anima mundi. And that, at a very foundational level, I think is what will lead to our survival or not as a civilization. So there's much more that could be said there, but.
Well, there was a lot of discussion about how we could get to a collective myth. And obviously, that's very difficult if we have to start from the myths that humans have lived by for the last 5,000 years, let's say, because everybody has their opinion about them. But in terms of humanity, there is one myth that we can all agree to, and that is the myth that we all live in the same leaky lifeboat. And if our species is going to survive at all, we are going to have to patch that lifeboat up and make sure that it continues to be. And we have to come up with ways to do that from every culture, not only our own. And so that does not necessarily imply anybody's religion or belief system being required, or anybody's God being required. It requires that we all get into one myth that everybody can concur is an important one. Do you have any thought about that?
Well, I think that this is why this participatory perspective can be very helpful, because it affirms the plurality of religious and spiritual perspectives and experiences. It affirms what already is. And it doesn't try to privilege, this is the right one and all the rest are wrong. And it also doesn't try and impose externally, this is the new myth, we all have to get on board, because that's not going to work either. It has to be something that naturally arises. That's always been the case, that something naturally arises. And that's where both really being attuned to our own agency and responsibility as those co-creative agents with the divine mystery, and also trusting in it. So not letting go, not just saying I give up. I give up all agency to the divine. God will make it work out. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying we need to hold both responsibility, personal agency, and trust in that divine mystery. And between those two, maybe something can arise. And perhaps maybe something is arising already, and we are all learning to see it through our different lenses.
Well, I thank you everyone for coming. We've had an incredible turnout today, including people, just for the record, from Australia. Nicole is here at 5 o'clock in the morning, and for her time, and she's been here since the middle of the night. From Australia, Asia, Europe, North and South America. And so it's just been an incredible experience to have everyone here. And thank you so much, Becca, for participating with us. I think it is one of the most profound meetings that we've ever done. In a panoply of profound meetings, but this is very significant, and I very much appreciate your being here. Now, I did promise Becca a graceful exit, but we have 25 people listening on YouTube and another 44 here on Zoom, so I don't propose to just shut you down, but I think we can all applaud Becca for her presentation, and thank you so much for coming and giving us these insights, which have been incredible. I'll have to listen to this many times in order to fully integrate it, but I think it's very useful. And this is part of my objective in doing this, is to get these ideas out into the world, and that seems to have been done today. So I appreciate it. So thank you, Becca, for being here. And I will continue to be here and chat with others if you want, or you want to speak up, but otherwise, if people are just going to leave, then let me just mention that I put several times on here the link. I've been forced to go on to MailChimp in order to avoid sending people emails that they don't want. And so I urge you to register on that methodology, which will indicate your willingness to receive emails from me. And if you don't, then you won't. and certainly I will, Becca, I would appreciate your suggestion of anyone else that we should include in these discussions. I expect that if I look at my YouTube stats right now, we've had up to 25 here. So that means probably as many as a couple of hundred people have stopped in at one time or another during the 2.5 hours that we've been talking. So it will spread your name far and wide, but some of these ideas far and wide, which I really think is the main purpose of my work for the last 4 years. So,
well, I just want to thank you again for the invitation, and to all of you for being here. And if you do want to dive further into these ideas, or just not have it, receive all of it in a auditory form, the essay that this is all based on is available in the 4th volume of Jung's Red Book for our time. The essay is just titled The Participatory Imagination. I see a couple people holding it up. Amazing series. I'm so honored to be part of it. When I was starting my Ph.D. work, a couple years in was when the first volume came out, and I just had the thought of, oh, I would someday love to be able to have an essay in there. And so when I was actually invited to include one, it was such a, I was just so extraordinarily pleased and excited. So it's laid out there. You could underline it and also get the sources that I'm drawing on too, so that you can read more deeply into participatory spirituality and Platonic philosophy and the participatory turn and all of that.
Becca, please do send me an email with the link to your October 23rd event, because I would definitely, I'll put that in the description of this video, but I also would definitely want to participate myself. So
wonderful. I will do that. Absolutely. And I hope to see some of the rest of you there too.
Yeah. Terrific.
Thank you all so much, and have a beautiful rest of your day and weekend. Take care.
And this will be replayed on Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group on YouTube, if you're not aware of that. I can just in the chat, I'll put the link to the homepage of the channel so that you can find it easily. It's going to be shown as still live for several hours. Whoops, I sent that only to one person, so let me send that to everybody. And if you're on YouTube, you're already on the channel, but here's the main link for the channel just in case. So does anybody have any other thoughts or any suggestions of other speakers that we should have? I'd welcome that, including nominating yourself if you want. And I'm not going to shut anybody right down right in this moment. Colleen, I see you're here. Did you have any comment about the active imagination vis-a-vis your art? I would wonder if...
Well, thank you for asking, and thank you, Becca. This has really been an inspiring morning. Wonderful to hear you articulate what's so important for us to be hearing about, particularly the whole concept of participation, Mystique. I just want to capitalize the participation part, which is what we as artists have been endeavoring to do, and to deepen our understanding of what it is that we've been doing all this while. Is just expanded my mind and deepened my understanding, particularly since, Donald, when you and I first contacted each other at the election in 2016, and I asked, are there any Jungians thinking about what's going on? I think that Jung's description of the two kinds of art that he talks about in the Red Book, or in the introduction, about the objective art and non-objective art, and what happens. I'm a psychologist, and so I'm very interested in what it is that happens when we go from the objective art to the non-objective art, or objective art to engaging in participation mystique, and how we do that. And I think that time for the participation part of it is so important. So thank you for asking, Donald. It's really good too.
My pleasure, and I'm glad that Becca connected me up with participation mystique, because I hadn't made that connection before. And,
if I could just quickly, it's as if a spider knows how to weave a web, but it's no good if it doesn't.
Right. Well, as I often say, we all need to get creative, because that's how we avoid the dragons and devils. And it doesn't matter how we're creative. We can go to the cooking store, the art store, the the tool department at Sears, or whatever it is. And if we want to know what we want, just pick the type of store you think you might want to go to, and then just walk up and down the aisles and see what speaks to you. And whatever that is, pick it up and start to work with it. And it may turn out it's not the right thing for you, but on the other hand, it may be incredibly meaningful to you. And like anything, you need to start and make a lot of mistakes. Just in the process of creating this YouTube channel, I've made plenty of mistakes, but gradually it's become more and more powerful. And today, since last night at 10 o'clock, we've had two very, very powerful sessions. Last night we had a session with Eva Ryder on the Kabbalah and the Tarot, which was extremely powerful also. So much so that one person in Nashville wrote to me and said she waited for the replay to come up, and then she listened to the whole thing a second time and didn't go to bed. And she was writing to me at 4:30 in the morning Nashville time, because she had to listen to it a second time right then. And so I think many of these discussions that we've been having, and especially during August and late July, when we started with Ann Ulanoff and a few others, have been extremely powerful sessions. And so it's great to have a growing community. And just to remind you that because of restrictions on email messages to many people, I've reached the point where I have to get your permission. And so that means I need for you to go on the MailChimp item and say what you're interested in receiving emails about. There's several categories there. On this YouTube channel, in the coming year, we're going to be having our Monday night session, which is at 8 p.m. every Monday night. And for the coming year, that's going to be all about the Tarot as a roadmap for life. And it is not about divination. I did Tarot divination back in 2017 and 2018, and you can find that on this YouTube channel. But this will be connecting up all the cards of the Tarot with your own life, and we'll be doing that in great detail. And so tomorrow night we'll be doing the High Priestess, which is the anima, of course, and it's the mystery of the feminine. And that will be an interesting session. And so that's every night, Monday night at 8 p.m. Every Wednesday at 1 o'clock, we have our advanced reading group. And in that, we're discussing Lament of the Dead. That was a series of discussions between James Hillman and Sonu Shamdasani that they did back in 2011, I believe, where they went around the country and had 15 different discussions and conversations about the Red Book. And so the Lament of the Dead is the transcripts of those 25 or those 15 conversations. And so we're discussing those conversations in great detail in the advanced reading group on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock. Other than that, there will be continuing presentations like this. There are a few planned in the immediate future, but the next one that comes immediately to mind is Dr. John Jackson, who is a retired psychiatrist from California, who will be speaking to us on September 15th, Tuesday, September 15th at 2 p.m. On the topic of Answer to Job, which is one of Dr. Jung's most powerful, I would say, books, most important books. It's also one of his most controversial books, I suppose, from a Abrahamic religion point of view, but it's important to know those things. And so Dr. Jackson will be talking to us on September 15th, and I will be inviting others over the time. I'll just put a bee in Colleen's ear that maybe we would have you appear one of these days if you're interested. But you don't have to answer now. I'm just I'm just suggesting that it might be interesting to have you, and you can let me know privately. So is there anything else? It's great to see my regular friends here, and Tim, who's my partner on these Wisdom Path colloquia, is indisposed with a family emergency this weekend, but I expect to see him back sometime soon. So anything else? Okay, I won't make it painful. I'll see you again soon. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 p.m. With the continuation of the Tarot presentations. So peace. Take care, everyone.
Good job, Skip. Thanks.
Thank you, Joss. Thank you all.